Uh, yes. Dr. Yoshitaka Ota, Assistant Professor at the University of Washington School of Marine and Environmental Affairs, and the Director of the Nippon Foundation Ocean Nexus. Our first speaker will be Dr. William Boyd. So Dr. Boyd, if you would like to tell us about your topic. Thank you so
Great.
much.
Thanks, James, and thanks everyone. It's great to be here. I am not an oceans person, and I gather that's partly the focus of this group. So I'm really looking forward to hearing some of the other panelists, more specific presentations on oceans. I was going to talk just broadly about federal climate policy and sort of how things seem to be shaping up with the Biden administration. Some of the things that I think we have reason to be encouraged by or excited about, but also some concerns kind of going forward. And I'll try to be brief because I gather there's some Q&A time in our individual sessions as well, and perhaps maybe at the end. So needless to say, the 2020 election was very positive in terms of prospects for climate action at the federal level here in the United States. And obviously that kind of ripples out around the world in many respects, but also I think emboldens climate action at the state level as well. The Biden administration has moved very quickly to push and to shape a bold climate agenda. I think many people were in some ways pleasantly surprised by how bold and wide-reaching or wide-ranging the Biden climate agenda is. To date, there's sort of been four main pieces of the Biden climate agenda. There's a whole bunch of other things going on, but the four big pieces so far: the COVID recovery bill, which actually includes a number of climate-friendly provisions, including something on the order of like $35 billion for renewable energy, a phase out of hydrofluorocarbons, which is a very potent greenhouse gas, among other things. His executive order on climate change, which really kind of takes a whole of government approach to climate action and really centers justice and equity. For the first time, I think we have a federal government or an executive, a president that is trying to center environmental justice at the heart of everything that they're trying to do on climate and environment more generally. The infrastructure bill, the American Jobs Act, which is sort of out there in concept right now, but is I think, we'll have to see if that moves this summer. There, the package that the Biden administration has put on the table, $2.3 trillion, whatever the number is, includes massive spending on infrastructure, particularly electricity transmission, that is vital to move renewable energy from the renewable rich areas of the country to the areas where there's a lot of demand. Investments in electric vehicle charging infrastructure, in electric buildings, and most importantly, in my view, a clean energy standard, which is really the heart of the Biden climate plan, if you will. Clean energy standard would require that essentially we decarbonize the power sector by 2035. And we are nowhere close to that right now, but we're moving in the right direction. But this would dramatically accelerate efforts to decarbonize the power sector. And that then becomes the backbone for decarbonizing other sectors by electrifying transportation, electrifying buildings, electrifying other sectors of the economy. You don't get all the way to the sort of net zero target by 2050 by electrification, but you get pretty close. And so that's a really important part of the whole agenda. We'll see what happens. I'll come back to the prospects for the infrastructure bill in a minute. And then most recently at the Earth Day Climate Summit on April 22nd, President Biden announced a very bold new commitment for the United States to reduce US emissions roughly 50% below 2005 levels by 2030. And this is in the context of the Paris Agreement, which asks countries to essentially pledge what they can do to reduce emissions. And the idea behind the Paris Agreement is that then countries will come and basically create a virtuous competition where they are trying to ratchet up their ambition. And so the hope is that the United States, by taking a bold new commitment with respect to its Paris pledge, will then get other countries to do the same. We'll see. I think there's grounds for skepticism about whether the US can ultimately deliver, but it certainly is a positive sign, and I think shows very much that the United States is re-engaging on climate. There are also obviously various different agencies that are working to reverse the Trump rollbacks, including allowing California to once again move forward with its own greenhouse gas standards for motor vehicles, and a whole host of other things across various agencies, primarily EPA, but also to some extent the Department of Transportation, and other agencies as well. But what we're seeing now, I think, in addition to kind of reversing those rollbacks, also a lot of action within those agencies, EPA, the Department of Energy, Department of Transportation, USDA, and others, to really start to think about the regulatory actions they can take under existing statutory authority to make progress on the climate agenda. So if you put all of that together, it is obviously a dramatic shift from where we were in the previous administration. A few big themes to keep in mind in all of this, again, as noted, and I think as a sign or a reflection of the really different world we're in now after the pandemic, but after the protests last summer, after the murder of George Floyd, and the kind of recognition that justice and equity really needs to be at the heart of the climate agenda and the environmental agenda more generally. The Biden administration really is trying to center justice and equity concerns in their climate agenda. They are taking a sort of what they call a whole of government approach, and that means appointing climate hawks throughout the executive branch, and getting all agencies to think about what they can do to push the climate agenda forward, which is quite different than previous administrations that often focus on a particular policy instrument like carbon price, and sort of assume that that's going to be the horse that we're going to ride. And here we see the entire government trying to mobilize around the climate emergency. A third big theme, as I mentioned, is the focus on the power sector, and in particular the use of a relatively simple and I think very effective instrument, the Clean Electricity Standard, which is essentially like what California has. We call it a renewable portfolio standard, but it's the same basic idea. And about 30 states have these particular instruments with various levels of stringency. But the basic idea is it just sets benchmarks for how much electricity needs to come from eligible renewable resources. And the Biden proposal, which is again part of the infrastructure plan, requires full decarbonization of the power sector by 2035 and roughly 80% carbon-free electricity by 2030. Now, the devil's in the details, but that's basically, we're at roughly 40% carbon-free electricity today. So it's a massive increase over the next decade. And as noted, that's sort of the backbone for the broader decarbonization effort. That really allows for the electrification of transportation and the decarbonization of transportation, of buildings, and other sectors of the economy. I think the last big theme is just the sense of urgency. There is, for the first time, I think, a sense of urgency around climate that I don't think we saw with Obama. We certainly didn't see it with previous Democratic presidents. There's a recognition that we have really less than a decade, or a decade at most, to really make major progress if we want to hit the targets, the mid-century targets that everyone feels are extremely important if we want to avoid significant climate disruption. Some concerns to note, there's only so much a president can do with executive orders and with regulatory actions under existing statutes like the Clean Air Act. And so to get big things done and to really move this agenda forward, we need new legislation. And there's as everyone knows, a very thin majority in the House and the Senate. It's quite possible the Democrats could lose one or both of those in the 2022 midterm elections. So there's a limited amount of time, basically about a year, to get new legislation through Congress. By next summer, by next June of 2022, everybody's going to be out campaigning. It'll be very hard to get anything through Congress. It's possible, but it gets a lot harder. And so roughly 12 months from today, maybe a little more, maybe 14 months or so, to get legislation through Congress. Of course, it's a razor thin majority in the Senate. And Senator Manchin from West Virginia has already made clear that he's not going to vote to get rid of the filibuster. And the Republicans don't seem particularly interested in playing ball on big, bold legislation around climate. So that leaves this somewhat obscure process known as budget reconciliation, which comes out of the 1974 Budget Reconciliation Act, which allows the Senate to move certain kinds of bills, certain kinds of legislation that involve taxing, spending, and budget issues through the Senate with a simple majority, right? And that's basically the horse that the Biden team is trying to ride here. You can do a lot with this, but there are some things that you can't do with this. And ultimately, a nonpartisan person who works in the Senate parliamentarian, gets to decide whether in a particular bill, things in that bill can go through budget reconciliation or not. And we'll have to see if President Biden can get most of his infrastructure bill, most of the climate related issues in the infrastructure bill through budget reconciliation. It's possible that that core policy instrument, the Clean Electricity Standard, would not, right, be able to go through budget reconciliation, which then I think creates all kinds of challenges. The other concern to note here is that if EPA, well, when EPA starts to move forward with aggressive regulations under the Clean Air Act, similar to what President Obama did with something called the Clean Power Plan, it's quite possible that that doesn't survive a legal challenge, because we now have, as you probably know, a Supreme Court that is more conservative than it was under President Obama. And there was already a lot of concern that the Clean Power Plan would likely not survive a challenge in the Supreme Court had it gotten up there. But ultimately, that was all kind of precluded by the 2016 election. And so the regulatory efforts, that is the use of the existing statutory authority, is also somewhat constrained by a conservative judiciary and in particular a conservative Supreme Court. So what does that mean moving forward? Well, obviously, I think there's a lot of merit in what the Biden team seems to be doing in terms of pushing for strong federal action across the board at all and with all policy levers that they can pull as quickly as they can. I think we're starting to see things kind of slow down though now as we start to think about this big infrastructure bill. The goal is that that would go through sometime this summer, maybe before July 4th, but we'll see. There's lots of ways you can slow things down in the Senate. The states are still extremely important. California continues to lead the way on climate and clean energy policy. I think the genius of our federal system is that the states have a lot of authority to do a lot of things. They are the laboratories of democracy, and I think we will continue to see bold state action across the country that will continue to put pressure on federal action. And so that kind of dual nature of our kind of government, the fact that we have strong kind of semi-autonomous state sovereign governments, right, that ultimately, are they can ultimately be preempted by federal authority in many respects, but they have a lot of authority on their own to push things, and they're really, really important in this and have been for more than a decade. I think we'll see a lot of effort to continue pushing for international cooperation and action. There are big questions about how much cooperation we will see between the United States and China. There's a very interesting set of dynamics kind of playing out there with respect to who will be able to kind of seize the lead in the clean energy future. And I think the Biden strategy in some ways is trying to play up the competition with China to really dominate those industries, which are multi-trillion-dollar industries going forward. But finally, and I think most importantly, the thing to keep in mind is that what really is going to keep things moving forward is ongoing political mobilization, and in particular the climate movement, and in particular the youth movement. I think the one thing that has really changed with respect to climate politics over the last several years, it was interrupted a bit by the pandemic, but I think it's still very much the case, is just the generational rage that we see around the climate issue. And I think as that continues to build and continues to force policymakers to acknowledge this and think about this in new ways, that's how you ultimately get institutional change and structural change in major new laws. You can look back at history and you cannot find a period in history when you see major new laws, major lawmaking moments, right? When Congress ultimately comes together and passes major new legislation, except in response to these broad-based political movements. And so I think it's really important to kind of keep that in mind and recognize that that work is in some ways the foundation for everything else going forward. So I'll stop there and turn it back over to you, James.
Thank you, Dr. Boyd. Yes, that was awesome. I think just to stay on time, we will skip the questions for this round, but all the questions that we have at the end, we can make sure that they all get addressed after all of our speakers have gone. So next, we will be hearing from Anna Cummins. She will be sharing her screen, giving a little presentation, and thank you, Anna.
Oh, wait, there we go. It would help if I unmuted. All right, good afternoon. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's truly an honor to be here. My name is Anna Cummins, and I'm one of the co-founders of an organization called the Five Gyres Institute. We did start as an oceans organization, but we're slowly crawling our way upstream, as evidenced by this picture. Oftentimes people think of plastic as an oceans problem, but over the last 5 years, we've really expanded our understanding of this issue and where the rubber meets the road. This is a photo I took on a toxic tour in Houston, Texas, where you see plastic pollution, plastic production, climate change, fossil fuel infrastructure, and environmental racism all collide in a really evident way. But I did get started in the oceans. I learned about this issue of plastics when I was a young graduate student, and I was so compelled back in 2001 hearing about plastic in the Pacific that I weaseled my way onto this research voyage in 2008 to cross the North Pacific Gyre, an oceanic current system. And this was a life-changing expedition for me in several ways. One, just seeing plastic in the oceans firsthand, seeing this vast expanse of ocean that everywhere we sampled, we found plastic. The other big life-changing event happened when the director of research and education on this expedition in the background fished out some derelict fishing gear, made a little ring, and proposed. And I said yes, and so we started our journey together. His name is Dr. Marcus Erickson. That's not him in the front, in the very back. And as a former Marine and Gulf War veteran himself, he has another angle on the justice issues around plastic pollution, and that we send our young to kill and be killed for access to foreign oil. We started the organization really to close the gap on the understanding of plastic globally, because there was no research in the Southern Hemisphere gyres, these oceanic current systems. So that was our goal in 2008, and that took us forward to really research plastic around the world, finding plastic in virtually every compartment we looked in, from the ice cores of the Arctic to the camels, to the stomachs of camels in the deserts of Dubai, to the surface of every ocean around the world. It's a relatively new material though. So this has happened in a short period of time, a combination of some really heavy marketing by fossil fuel industries to market this lifestyle of disposability, and plastic has really given plastic this rocket trajectory over the last 50 years, 20-fold increase, and those numbers are predicted to double or triple by 2050 of our production of plastic. But what has not kept pace with that level of production is our ability to recover, manage, and deal with this material. This stat is often used of only 9% of plastic ever produced has ever been recycled, but actually recycling plastic in the way you and I think of making a product and turning it into a comparable product is somewhat of 2%. The rest is lost to the environment, incinerated, which has heavy health impacts on communities around the world. Our research really started with looking at what happens when it's lost at sea. So over the last 10 years, we've researched all 5 gyres. We gathered data and we coupled our data together with data from many other scientists from around the world to come up with the first global estimate. I'm sure many people here have already heard about the ecosystem impacts on marine wildlife. This is a fish my husband Marcus caught when he was crossing the Pacific on a raft we built out of 15,000 plastic bottles in an airplane. He sailed from Long Beach to Hawaii, caught this fish intending to eat it, and cut open the stomach on a whim to find it full of 17 pieces of plastic. Now, this is only one fraction of the health impacts of plastic. Really, the bigger harm from plastic is further upstream. We'll talk about that in a bit. But so yes, this is that 2014 global estimate that we produced, coupling data from around the world. We're in the process of updating this model now to come up with a more comprehensive look at how much plastic is out there. But one of our big takeaways from producing this study is that much as plastic is a huge issue in the oceans, it's less than 1% of what we produce on land that makes its way into our seas. And really the much bigger harm is community health, climate change, and a host of other issues. The other thing we noticed going out to sea is that you can't really hold anyone accountable to microplastics. The vast majority of what we see in our oceans are fragments of plastic, and you can't identify the source, the product, the company, the country, and it's very difficult to hold anyone accountable for this damage. That's what inspired us to go into the Great Lakes in partnership with the university, SUNY University in Fredonia, to look at microplastics in the Great Lakes. And what we found was very unexpected. We found more plastic by count in Lake Erie than any of the oceans we'd surveyed. And we identified these little fragments to come from consumer products, personal care products like facial scrubs, body washes. We thought we had a smoking gun in hand by producing the science, a peer-reviewed study, taking it to producers, Procter & Gamble, Unilever, not to name any names. But what they came back with is until you can prove that it's our beads getting into the waters, we have nothing to go by. So that's why we decided to go more of an advocacy angle. And here's the paper. Shout out to UCLA students. We worked with some honors students back when we were doing this campaign, and they were able to phase microbeads out of the student store, and this really helped us gain some traction in the state of California. Then we were able to assemble a larger coalition of many organizations working together, from Storia Stuff to NRDC to on and on and on, because our big takeaway working on this is that policy change is slow and arduous, and it requires radical collaboration. And thanks to the efforts of this whole coalition, first passing a bill in the state of California, we were able in the final weeks of 2015 to get a federal bill passed to ban the sale and manufacture of personal care products that contain plastic microbeads. Our other big takeaway here is the importance of local level legislation to really scale. We would not have been able to pass a national bill had we not had a strong bill in the state of California, because you cannot manufacture one product for California and another for the rest of the country. So this really, again, underscored for us the power of local, statewide legislation that can really scale to be national or even global. When we think of solutions, though, it's important to recognize with plastic that not all sectors are created equally. We have hospital waste, sanitary waste, all these different categories, and each intervention needs to be specific. We have chosen to focus on consumer packaged goods, but all of these require innovation and policy change. Also, looking at solutions, it's important to look at the shifting landscape. One, in the past 5-6 years, a new coalition has emerged, a movement really looking at plastic with a justice lens, looking predominantly at the impacts on the global south, and really trying to change the narrative of plastic being an ocean problem and really being an environmental justice and environmental racism problem, that whole supply chain of fossil fuels. Another big thing that's happened is an increasing recognition of the linkages between plastic and climate change, with a lot of fossil fuel companies really hanging their hat on global demand for plastic to really boost what is a failing industry. The bottom left-hand corner, I put a photo that I took after doing the toxic tour in Houston. I was inspired to do a toxic tour in my own city of Los Angeles. And here is Wilmington, where you can see predominantly communities of color right next to fossil fuel activities, incinerators and refineries, and the health impacts of that are enormous. And then the breakdown of our recycling system has really, with China no longer wanting cheap and dirty waste exports from the US and other countries, has really caused a ripple effect around the world. So a couple of quick thoughts on solutions. Again, the importance of local engagement and looking at the linkages between plastic, fossil fuels, petrochemicals. This is a young woman who I admire enormously in Los Angeles. Some of you might have heard of her, Nayeli Kobo. And with her community and her mom and lots of people in the area, they were able to shut down, at least for 4 years, some of the activity of Alanco oil, because many of the young people, including herself, were getting very sick from living next door to a refinery. Nayeli is an incredible speaker, one of our ambassadors to many organizations, and again, the power of engaging at the local level. Of course, we need to redesign and reimagine our way out of this problem. We need to think of new ways to deliver goods and services to people that aren't reliant on fossil fuels. We need science, and this is where we're really focusing as an organization. Having done the global monitoring in the ocean, we're now turning that science lens to better vet and understand innovations and solutions to make sure they're legit. For example, looking at this form of bioplastic that we want to test to see, is it truly marine and terrestrial, compostable, degradable, and could it be a promising market alternative for things like agricultural mulch and throwaway plastics? We need to change the narrative, push back on this idea of waste is a people problem, and really hold corporations that make these products, hold them accountable. There's been an attempt by industry to point the finger at Southeast Asia for being countries that leak plastic. And these activists have pushed back by saying, we're gonna count how much is Coca-Cola, how much is Nestle, and you tell us who's accountable for this problem. And for true accountability, we really need advocacy to level the playing field. So there's some exciting policy on the table right now. There's the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act that's gaining some traction. And this will really look at some of the things I've talked about: waste exports, producer responsibility, and a host of other things. And there's a need for UN global action. So to conclude, I just want to again illustrate the importance of local action. We worked with some young students at a school in Silver Lake, 6th, 7th, and 8th graders at Thomas Starr King Middle School. They got rid of styrofoam trays on their campus. They did a little art activism. With that single move, they saved their school $12,000. That got the attention of the entire district, and LA Unified School District banned styrofoam trays across the district. So young people have enormous power. Local actions can ripple. And I'm just ending with a shot of our ambassadors around the world who are really driving change in their communities. Thank you so much. And I will stop sharing.
Thank you, Anna.
And back to you, James.
Thank you. We have one question from the chat. What is the most effective way to recruit new people to the cause? So I guess like when you are looking to recruit more people to support Five Gyres and organizations like that, what do you think is the most effective way to get that message out?
Oh, that's a great question. I guess just really finding people for whom the issue resonates. You know, I love talking to young people, and I often tell them it doesn't really matter if plastic pollution is what moves you or if it's human rights. The important thing is to get engaged. So I guess I don't try and recruit so much as, you know, share our message, see who it resonates with, And if it resonates with them, provide them onboarding opportunities like joining the ambassador network, getting involved in local policy. So yeah.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, so I think next we will move on to our next speaker, Dr. Cinda Scott. And take it away, Dr. Scott.
Okay, am I unmuted? Yes. I'm trying to share this large, there we go. Okay, so first and foremost, thank you very much for having me. And I'm just gonna start my timer so that I'm not gonna go crazy here. All right, so I work for the School for Field Studies, and this center is the Center for Tropical Island Biodiversity Studies located in Bocas del Toro, Panama. And SFS, we have many programs around the globe, including Turks and Caicos, Peru, Chile, Costa Rica, Kenya, Tanzania, Bhutan, Cambodia, and Australia. So I'm going to approach this talk from what I do. And most importantly, that third part is that I work with local and national entities to support policies that promote conservation and sustainable use of our natural resources, in addition to doing my marine biology stuff, which is performing surveys, but also taking undergraduates who have elected to come on our program to study abroad into the field when they come. So Panama is located between Costa Rica and Colombia. It has a population of only 4.1 million people, and it is about the size of South Carolina. It has 10 provinces and 3 indigenous comarcas, and it has a lot of coastline, about 1,547 miles. And so that circular part up in the upper western side, the Western Caribbean side of the country, is where I reside. And this is just a close-up of a map of the archipelago of Bocas del Toro. It is comprised of about 9 different islands. And so we take students into the field, and this is our center. And importantly, we teach in the field. So we bring theory into practice. And on the upper left corner is students learning in the field. The upper right is speaking with the National Marine Park Manager, Tomas. Our students are learning from him. We also engage with the local community. We've had a swim team program for young girls from the other side of Isla Colón Island in Boca del Drago for the last 6 years. And we also engage with local park guards, doing various different kinds of charlas and talks, and sharing our knowledge with the greater community. So when you look at Bocas del Toro online, it is marketed as this amazing paradise. We have everything. We have ocean, we have rainforest, it is tropical, it's warm, it's wonderful. And when you look at the population and you look at what's going on in Bocas, you'll see that the islands have approximately 225,000 tourists a year. And there are, on the island that I live on, about 9,000 people that live there. So this is a tourist place. The population is very mixed up. You have Afro-Antillanos, indigenous peoples, mostly Nabe Bugle, Chinese Panamanians, Panamanian mestizos, and immigrants from the United States, Europe, and South America. The life expectancy for Panamanians is 80 years old, and for indigenous Panamanians, that drops down to about 68 years old. And the indigenous population in Bocas del Toro, which is predominantly Nabe Bugle, is about 80,000, of which almost half of that population is 15 years or younger. And Panama is a middle income country, and it has the second worst income distribution, where you have the top 20% of earners controlling 50% of the economy. And in terms of culture, I think it's important to highlight that Bocas is a highly collectivistic society, and Panama in general is a highly collectivistic society. It's a very small town. It's home to the nation's largest indigenous group. There are 4 languages spoken on the island, including Spanish, Wari-Wari, Navere, and English. And I say all of this because I think having a deep understanding of culture wherever you go is absolutely important in understanding how to practice conservation in a way that includes local people, local values, and traditions. And so when you look at Panama, you can use the Hofstede Index, which is a metric of culture, and it has 5 different dimensions, one of which is individualism. And when you look at individualism versus collectivism in Panama, the index rates Panama at 11. And the United States is listed as 91, which is the most individualistic culture in the world. Panama has a value of 11. It is one of the most collectivistic cultures in the world. And this has serious consequences for how we're able to practice conservation and therefore push policy. Because if you look at, for example, communication, if you look at how people value and understand opinions, and if you look at how people from different countries look at others, this becomes critical to the process of trying to push through or mention or get any policy to get lifted off the ground. So for example, with communication in an individualistic society, speaking one's mind is healthy. And in a collectivistic society, harmony should always be maintained. That has consequences for conservation. So what does this have to do with science? I recently did a TEDx talk on this because I believe that conservation has to be rooted in equity. Absolutely. And so when I ask this question to my students who come on our program, is paradise a paradise for everyone? As they start going around town, they're realizing that no, the answer is no. We have issues on our islands with trash, with coral bleaching, with unregulated development, coastal development, removal of mangroves. We have tourists that don't know how to interact with natural spaces and places well by lifting starfish out of the water. And in addition to these, we have other challenges. We have a great loss of biodiversity, and especially due to deforestation of mangroves. We're dealing with hypoxia. We're dealing with climate change and sedimentation and overfishing. We have it all in this very small area. And so the big question is, well, how do we solve these challenges, right? And I recently had the opportunity to go out with the Minister of Tourism. He's sitting right behind me. And this came about because there was a question as to whether or not the marine protected area should be expanded. And that brought, I mean, just a whirl of feelings up in me, because the original park that was established in 1988 completely excluded the local population, excluded their wants and desires, and lines were drawn and people were excluded. And so in an effort to try to get government officials in Panama to see what they're about to do, through writing the Bocas Hope Spot through Mission Blue, along with Krista Hsu, who is in charge of Mother of Corals in Bocas, she and I co-wrote the Hope Spot, and it gained national attention because all of a sudden Bocas is put on the map as a hope spot. What can we do? How can we work together to create change? And so we have this golden opportunity to take a high level national government official out to a reef. And I was able to show him, this is what happens when you have coral bleaching. This is what it looks like. And this is what a healthy reef looks like. And he was blown away. He had never been on a reef in his country. So this was very powerful. And so I just have a couple minutes left, but I do want to show you that this is the outline of the National Marine Park there on Isla Bastimentos. And the real question with MPAs is who really benefits. This is always something that is quite contentious when MPAs are being mapped out. And the question is this a well-designed marine park? And do we know? And what happens is you get these social conflict manifestations. So this paper was recently published in Marine Policy, and it mentions Bocas del Toro, and all of the pink circles represent when Bocas del Toro was mentioned for having a social conflict. So people feel that there are conflicts with, there's lack of trust, there's lack of transparency, there's no communication, there's food insecurity, illegal fishing, there's tourism pressure. It's all here. And that's because people were never included in the beginning of the creation of this marine park. And so I just want to reiterate that conservation requires all people, not just a few who have fancy degrees, but it includes everybody, including the gentleman in the front right. He's a good friend of mine. He's a fisherman, and he comes to every meeting. He is vocal. The woman in the pink shirt on the left, she is in charge of the Women's Cooperative on San Cristobal. And you have Angel in the center there. He's in charge of various NGOs throughout the years. You have Sergeant Sanchez. He's in charge of the tourism police. You have all the park guards present. This takes a community. Policy change is slow, but it takes the community coming together, and it takes all people. So I'm going to stop there because I could go on and on, but I just want to keep it at 10 minutes. So I'm happy to take questions if you'd like. And if you're really interested in building equity in ocean science, you're more than welcome to head to my website. And I'm always happy to communicate with any students who are interested. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Scott. That was awesome. Yeah. Oh, it looks like in the chat we have, in your experience, do you think the collectivistic nature of Panama makes it easier to push conservation initiatives, or does it depend on each situation?
Well, I would say it depends on each situation, but if you can get a lot of people interested in a topic, everyone all of a sudden is interested in this topic, much more so than I've seen in the US, where everyone feels like they have to chime in with their 10 cents and, and all that. Whereas in Panama, it is quite different. The way in which people accept change. So if you have a community leader who says, okay, this is what we're going to do, then everyone is pretty much on board, or you will be ostracized from the group. And that's where that individualism versus collectivism really kicks in. It's really important to understand that when you go into any field of conservation or trying to create policy change, you have to know the culture with which you're dealing with.
Yeah, awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we have lots of questions, so we can take one more real quick. What is the hardest part about engaging the local communities?
Well, I'm an other, right? I am way other. I am not from Panama. I have a strong Boston Spanish accent. And yeah, it's tough, but I've been there for 7 years, and you have to show your value through your work. They want to see evidence that you aren't just going to flitter away, that you're not just going to be one of these other, there are so many groups that come into Bocas. I can't tell you. They go into a community, they don't ask what the community needs. They put in latrines, they disappear, and the people are like, who are these people? Do we need this? We didn't ask for this, right? And again, it has to do with the lack of cultural competence and a lack of understanding of what is actually needed. And I see it over and over, and it is infuriating, and it is very much rooted in privilege and entitlement, and it's a mode of conservation that really needs to stop. And there are a lot of intersectionalities at play. And so in a much larger talk, I go really into that. But yeah, it is all connected.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for presentation. And now we will move on to Dr. Ota.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Anna Cummins, who's my project coordinator. I was in another meeting, so she sort of helped me to be on 2 conference.
Awesome, for sure.
Okay, is my screen shared?
Yes, your screen is shared.
Okay, and then now I have to do the slideshow, yeah?
Yes.
Okay, is it working?
Yes.
Right, so shall I start? Well, before I start, Cinda, what a presentation. It was brilliant, you know, and then I'm sure under the COVID situation, the many island nations, you know, who depend on the tourism is really having a hard time. You know, I hope your people, you know, is recovering and then doing okay. You know, yeah, my sincere care to that, and then I hope to talk to you some other time.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
all other panelists, you know, Anna and Dr. Boyd. I mean, I'm fond of your guys' work, and then I hope to connect with you sometime. So I'm gonna start my talk. So this is Ocean Nexus Center. It's a research center I established. I created a year and a half ago, and it's a research center that I'm hoping to do so like three things. But the main aim is really to put the social equity as a center for ocean governance. And to do so, what we're really looking for in the simplest term, right, is to recognize inequity and recover from failure and the pain, and then reverse the injustice. And then that's the whole point of it. But recognize also includes recognize some BS, which is everywhere. So, you know, thank you for bringing up MPN and all sorts. So for the recognition of it, I mean, we write something like, you know, the paper to really argue the concept of the one ocean is appealing, but at the same time, we really have to think about oceans because we experience oceans in a very different way. And then there is values and diversities, including in the way that we relate to the ocean. We also argue with the papers, we actually claim satellite data could actually find the evidence of the forced labor in the ocean. And we say, no, you cannot, or at least you haven't really provided enough evidence that you could do so. So really to bring the resource much more closer to the victims or people, you know, suffering from all these horrible horrors and potentially to work on the ground. So that's the sort of things we do so far. So this is really the vision of it. We believe there's inequality in oceans, and we, through the social equity and then recover, recognize, and reverse, we hoping to achieve oceans for all people. So why did I come to this? I have been a director of two different kind of like a program, and one started about 10 years ago, which is called Ocean Narratives. And that is really to predict the future ocean. So there was an idea about if we get the different scientists who works on the climate change, biodiversity, coastal habitat analysis, legal, and governance, and just, you know, tons of experts, and really to ask them, you know, if we could actually look what's going to happen in the future, then we can prepare. That was the idea. Quite naive, but it was quite catchy. So we did that for about like 9 years. And, you know, we really start, then I started this Nexus, which is much more social science oriented, much more looking into governance last year. And here's the reason why I did so. At the end of NERIS, which is basically this predicting ocean, future ocean project, which I did it with 15 different institutes, I came to basically two very simple conclusions. One is impact of global environmental change will be overall negative for our sustainability. I mean, nobody can deny that. It's really simple. And the other one is it also increases, you know, in global and local inequalities. And then the second one, yes, I mean, everybody knows about it, but at the same time, in the conservation, in the ocean narrative, the second one wasn't really mainstream. And so I recognized this, and then I thought, okay, let's really work on the second part of it, which is more diabolical and scary. So one of the reasons while I was working on the narratives, and by the way, I'm an anthropologist. I'm a social anthropologist trained in University of London. So very much quite, you know, strong, some Marxist background and social theory from French sociologists and so on and so forth. So never been natural scientist, not really know how to model, and doesn't really know about the legal, you know, framework and all this. So people call me why you are in position where you are. One of the reasons is potentially because I have been, I had a experience working with fishermen in various places. And then I started working on the interdisciplinary project. So somehow I kind of like a next thing connecting between science and community and some policy. And then that's why I was in that position. So anyway, so in the course of working in NERS, this interdisciplinary project, so I didn't really have much time to work on the field, which was really my trade, but I actually didn't have it because I have to coordinate and work with other 10, 15 institutes and the different scientists. And so that took all my time. But at the same time, I started thinking about it, okay, so what can I do anthropologically, sort of building kind of like this global overview for the oceans? And one of the things which, often annoyed me when I actually go to sort of like high level talk at the UN or meeting the policymakers on environmental NGO people is really whenever they ask about, okay, I said about, ocean and the fisheries are really important. I know conservation is very important, but at the same time, people just making a living out of the fisheries are extremely important, particularly for those communities who are really depending on it. And they said, yes, that's true, but how much? What's the scale? Where's the evidence? What's the global outlook? And we didn't have it. So I thought, okay, I'm going to create it. And this is what I did. I just picked up all the literatures and books and everything and then really estimate bottom up how much of an indigenous coastal community actually consume seafood. And that was, the result was, it's just numbers and everything. So it would be boring, but basically it actually showed how significant they are and how much, how important it is in comparison to basically average seafood consumption in the same region. And then it really showed the irreplaceable importance, not just culturally, but also for the food sovereignty. And while we're doing this, we actually came across with many communities, histories, reading about the colonization and issues, and which is still continues, and it really sort of like hidden behind.
I'm gonna have my boss leave.
Oh, good. Okay. Okay. And this is one of the example. It's a Sitka group in the northern Alaska where herrings, sort of like their spring food. Herrings comes back, put the egg and they pick it up and then they have it as a spring food. And then that really signifies what their actually seasonality is all about. But they can't catch this anymore. For the last 5-10 years, it's just really dropping because industrial fisheries actually take all the herrings, and I'm complicit because they take it to Japan. Right, so that's what it is, and that's what's happening. But unfortunately, the ministries and the management doesn't really listen to their claims, and this is what the problem is. And then when I was working on this coastal indigenous communities, and then we start looking into conflicts, and it just tons everywhere. We found it everywhere, injustice, and it's not simply about industrial fisheries versus local fisheries. It's against all the company, it's against the government, and then unfortunately sometimes conservation has caused some issues because they put the marine protected area in the places without really consulting people. And then also one place they put the marine protected area, the other place they don't. They ask for the behavioral change in the consent of putting a new hospital and new issues and new facilities, which is really not the just. So what I felt and what we are working on is really trying to fill the missing link. There's a overfishing, and what they wanted to say, they want to do the sustainable fisheries for the science. There's a blue economy, and they want to do the sustainable ocean economy, climate change, related to the climate action, adaptation, marine plastic, their waste, and then all sorts of things. But what's really missing is what should be in between. We have to think about food sovereignty. We have to think about the gender intersectionality, climate justice, global production, and decolonization. Those are things we really need to think about it. And that's what we are hoping to work on, and we've been working on. I'm going to pass this. There's things called a blue economy, which is going on now. And then it's supposed to be socially equitable, economically viable, ecological sustainable, but that's not the way which is going. And one of the reasons which we argue is so that on the left, there is a model. This is a famous sustainable development donut, right? So what they are claiming is there is a biosphere. We need to create a safe space in terms of environment. Society, we need to create a safe space in terms of, social safety and human security, and also, and then there is the economy. So this is the way things just goes up, right? And what we are hoping to change is change this narrative to start with the society. Really hoping the society is the base of our conservation, and then things will work for the biosphere and economy. And some people might argue, but this is my challenge. Finally, because this is supposed to be a policy, so there is a things called the Decade of the Ocean Science, and which basically looking into what we need to do first is understand the ocean. We need to understand the ocean. We need the data set, and then we can really think about the global societal outcomes. We argue that's not the way it should be. We really argue what you need to do is assess priority and the problems of ocean-dependent people. Let's start with the people, what they need. And then ocean science, understanding context of the problems. Use the science to understand the context and the problems. And then create the purpose and implement and test science-based solutions. Then this is based on SDG, look for the SDG outcomes, but really evaluate. It's just straightforward, policy process, but that's what the science at the moment is missing. So we're hoping that will change. So we just started, and we are hoping to go on 10 years or even more. And we're always recruiting people. We're in Seattle and everywhere. So we're not in where Cinda is, but if you're interested in, contact me, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ota. So it is almost 6 o'clock. So everyone who needs to go, feel free to leave. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I will keep the thing open for a while. If anyone wants to stay and talk, if anyone wants to, if any panelists want to stay and answer questions, they're welcome to. If you have to go, 100%. Thank you all so much for coming. But I will leave the Zoom room open, and everyone is welcome to hang out for as long as they would like.
There's one question in the chat.
Yes. We have Kobe asking Dr. Ota, how do you ensure that what people need does not overwhelm the natural systems?
That's a really tough question. I mean, but I suppose that's a science for, I believe. And it really depends, it becomes the important question to think about, like, what's the time scale and what is the cost? For instance, there's a claim about 30% of ocean should be a marine protected area. It was published in Nature, I think about like a month ago. And it was really interesting. They all talk about really good things may happen if we create 30% of ocean as a marine protected area, but they don't talk about the cost. So I really think if we can actually look for the both cost and the benefit, and it's not just a simple cost and a benefit, but in terms of diversity and value of the people who actually local community people really judge, then that will be the start. So there's no always insurance, but I think that's what we need to work on. Is that good enough answer? Not quite.
Oh, no, absolutely. Yeah. If any other panelists, because we are on the sort of open section now, any other panelists who would like to stay around, if you want to weigh in on that, feel free to jump in. If not, I can move on to another question we have.
I think, yeah. So I'm having a personal conflict with the 30% by 2030. I am completely against it. There is, you cannot approach it that way. It is absolutely does not take into consideration people and humans and nature. We've been dating seriously for like 350,000 years since we evolved, and for some reason in our conservation policies we ignore the people, and the result is catastrophic. It's awful. We are not paying attention to that very, very important relationship between people and nature. And instead you have these fortress conservation models that tell us that people should be out and, look at Serengeti, look at Yellowstone, look at places where people have often been violently and viciously removed in the name of conservation. So, and all of this is based off of colonization, and it's, so yeah. And it's weird because I did help to write this hope spot for Bocas. And as soon as I did it, I thought, oh God, what have I done? Because now this is another fortress conservation model that I don't necessarily believe in, but I can change it. I can. So, and that's exactly what I'm doing. I flew to Panama City to speak with Shirley Binder, who is now the director of protected areas for all of Panama. I spoke to her and I said, under no circumstances should the marine protected area in Bocas del Toro be expanded. And she looked at me like I was crazy. But it's really so that the policy directors at the national level can reach this 30% goal of who is this benefiting? There is no rhyme or reason to it. There is no reason underlying that particular percentage. And I had a very frank conversation with her and she said, well, isn't it better just to have a paper park at least? And I said, no, it's not. If it's not benefiting anything or anyone, what is the point? So I get very animated about these things, and as you can tell, and I will try to make change where I can.
Can I just add a little bit? And then people who, thinks protected area is a really good thing, and a more protected area potentially is really, wonderful things. And there's a couple of issues. One is when you actually put something like a 30%, this numerical target, to every countries, and it really becomes such a burden in some places. For instance, in the Pacific Island nations, where they really have to make a living out of their tuna fisheries. And it's not really a good deal at all, because they still very much colonized in terms of like a deal they make with countries who's coming to their water and fish. But yet, if they actually cover the 30%, some of the fishing fleet may actually go in somewhere else, and potentially they lose the revenue. And it's just like these countries doesn't really know what's the impact of it, but yet they're somehow pushed into this sort of 30% agenda. And the other things which really issue is exactly what the Cinda said. It was supposed to be 10%. I think by this year or by next year or something.
No, it was supposed to be 20% by 2020, because you got to have the matching.
Right. And they didn't make it. So they just pushed forward for something else. And then that's what it is. And then also the fearful things is this, okay, it sounds strange, but the marine protected area, to make it 30%, potentially undermines conservation. And you guys don't believe me. But what happened was, the idea of the marine protected area might be used as a tool to decouple development and environmental impact. So if we have blue economy, like a new industry, new development in the ocean, we can actually have a marine protected area that will kind of like secure our conservation commitment, which basically means we can actually develop somewhere else. So it really is, to some extent, win-win. You can have a development, you can have a conservation, but it's the water, it's in the ocean. And this is the particular things about the ocean. The boundary is so fluid that when things happen in one place, it goes to the other. You never be able to decouple these two things. But the marine protected area narrative and the tool somehow imposed a certain, anti-conservation or non-pro-conservation interest to push it forward. Does it make sense? Does it make sense, Dr. Boyd and Cinda and Anna?
Well, I just wanted to chime in there. I mean, MPAs are not necessarily my world, but I think what both of you are talking about, I see a lot in my world, and it's time and time again, sort of a supremacy colonial approach to setting policies, where the people who are going to be potentially impacted by those policies are not at the table. And if they are brought to the table, it's for the photo op, it's for, we need to have more diversity to show that this thing will pass. And that just continues to breed mistrust and doesn't build community, and ultimately it doesn't build power. So just in microcosm and in my world, we see these policies that sound so great on paper. It's, we're going to ban single-use plastics in this community. We're going to ban this, we're going to ban that. And that sounds great, but if you don't engage the people who potentially will be most impacted, for example, street vendors, restaurants, mom and pops, et cetera, if they are not at the table setting the policy from the get-go, then it's going to fail time and time again. And yeah, what we really need is to build power, and it doesn't build power.
I'll just say a couple things again, with the caveat that I'm not an oceans person, but I find it interesting to think about how the conservation models have moved across different domains. So I assume, and this, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I assume that the protected area concept that was developed for terrestrial ecosystems was sort of then transported into the oceans context, perhaps without a lot of thought and perhaps with a lot of big NGOs and big conservation money behind it. And that could be partly, the source of some of the challenges here. I will say that when you look at, like, I do a lot of work on tropical forests, and probably should have talked about that tonight, but if you look at the Amazon, for example, I think something like 25% of the Brazilian Amazon is in indigenous territories. And if you look at deforestation rates across the Amazon, they really are the guardians of the forest in many respects. The rate of deforestation, even in the context of Bolsonaro, which is basically trying to open up these indigenous territories to mining and exploitation in various ways, is still much lower than in the rest of the Amazon. And I don't know that that was necessarily a strategy. It sort of evolved, right? I think the conservation groups did come in at some point and started pushing for big, conservation protected areas in indigenous territories as well. But I think there were kind of multiple strands that were leading to that. I'm not saying it's successful, but I do think it suggests that creating sort of big chunks of territory for the people who were there first and have, I think, the strongest claim to that territory. There's something appealing about that, and I think that sort of pushes back against the colonialist dispossession model that we've seen, across much of the world. Again, not sufficient. I absolutely 100% agree that having everyone at the table and thinking about power and thinking about participation and shared governance is vitally important. I do a lot of work at the state level in Brazil and other tropical forest countries, the state and provincial level. And one of the things that we've been working on is trying to get state civil servants to actually understand and appreciate the importance of working with indigenous peoples and local communities, not groups that they have historically worked with very well. Most of the interaction is typically between indigenous people and the federal government, because often that's where the legal relationship is. But in some ways, it makes more sense to have them interacting directly with and trying to develop some shared governance at the state and even the local level. Very difficult to do, very difficult to establish those relationships and create that trust, particularly given the history there. But I definitely agree with everything that has been said in terms of, the tendency to fetishize kind of these big goals of 30 by 30 or 20 by 20 or, I guess 40 by 40 or 50 by 50 coming down the road, right? And thinking critically about how that then sucks all the air out of the room, really kind of frames the debate, drives a lot of the funding, right? And really ignores all the hard work that you guys are doing on the ground every day, where I see small groups doing very innovative things, but the big NGOs kind of roll in with their big, plans. They go to the World Economic Forum, they talk to the masters of the universe, and then Davos, sort of takes over from there. So yeah, anyway, I'll stop there. Sorry. I'm getting excited too.
Yes, thank you all so much.
About the indigenous people, there has been an interest from the conservation side to perhaps work with the indigenous people. That's great, and then I met a few people who's actually in that. And one thing I'm always not be suspicious, but really hoping for is they have this idea about indigenous people are closer to nature, and all that sort of things, and it almost as if they taking the initiative and the legitimacy of decolonization, so my friends who's in indigenous scholar is always start talking about like we really have to decolonize our decolonization. Somebody is taking our voice to use it for something else. I'm going to talk next week in National Marine Sanctuary Foundation, and with a couple of friends and people who's really working on this issue and the justice and equity, and then they're very concerned. The voice supposed to belong to the people in the community who's been working on the last long time is really has been taken by somebody else. It's easy to say equity. It's easy to say justice in the center, but but you haven't done anything. You have no record, you have no track record, and it just because you have a platform, you really cannot sort of take it over somebody else's voices. And then that's really what my friends and Indian scholars are talking about, and I'm quite supportive about that. So me as a scholar, hopefully we just keep looking into it and catch BS whenever I can.
The one more thing I'll say on this though is in the forest, the tropical forest, space. The one thing I think we've seen since really in the last 15 years or so is a recognition that land rights, land tenure, indigenous rights, human rights, and all of those are different things, is really becoming a very important part of the global conversation. In part because of in large part because of the advocacy and the hard work of indigenous peoples and their advocates. And the UN Special Rapporteur and others have really been promoting this, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. That's not going to solve the problem. And in some ways there could be unintended consequences, but it certainly has, I think, created a dynamic that makes it harder to just ignore this. And there's a legal strategy there that then plays out in different ways in different national contexts. It strikes me that when you think about oceans, the legal strategy, the rights-based approach is a much harder strategy if it even makes sense, right? And that's where it seems to be you run into all kinds of challenges about, one, could you even create the right? And two, could you even enforce it? And if you can't really enforce a right, then it's not really a right at the end of the day.
Yeah, enforcement is probably the biggest problem, particularly with marine protected areas. The majority of marine protected areas fail. They are failures. We know this. It's been documented. There have been multiple studies across different countries highlighting this, and it's because there's serious lack of enforcement. And that's one of the things I brought up to the minister and to other people in Panama. For example, if you want to expand a park, how is it possible that we don't even have enforcement in the current park? And you want to expand, there are 8 park guards for 13,000 hectares. That's it. And only 4 on at a time. And there's 1 boat. It doesn't work. So we need to rethink what MPAs are just in general. While it's like a dream fantasy, and we've got to get out of the fantasy because it doesn't work.
Can I just add, sorry, Dr. Boyd, when in the ocean context, when people talk about rights, particularly in indigenous and coastal communities, he always ended up just talking about access. And then there's just so much more than that. But they only ended up sort of like access. And then hence it becomes a number with a quota, number of the fishing rights, and then that would be it. And it completely misses rights of the land, coastal land, rights of the cultural heritage, rights of the food sovereignty, those things really becomes, kind of like ignored or pushed into the side. So it's, scholarly, it's interesting. And also for the people, it's really serious issues.
Yeah, no, I've spent some time with the Makah tribe up on the very tip of the Olympic Peninsula, and they have like 2 days a year where they can go out and fish for halibut. They're obviously heavily regulated in terms of when they can go whaling and things like that, and that's been some part of the conflict and controversy up there. But yeah, I hear you.
Sorry, I just want to address the question because it would take me too long to type, but there's a question in the chat that says, how can we make this, sorry, it says, what would be a good alternative or adjustment to MPAs to make marine conservation more effective? So in addition to including people, it's very complicated, but so it's been found that the most effective MPAs, which in the entire world, it's like 2% of the surface of the ocean, right, are effective MPAs. And that's because there's absolutely zero fishing, no take whatsoever. So we've really got to reassess not only the connections between ecosystems, because that is missing as well. You've got to have that mangrove to reef connection. You have to have, bay to open ocean connection. And a lot of times these MPAs that were built in the 80s or established in the 80s didn't take those things into consideration. So it's almost like we just need to, it's like starting over, but how can you do that when you already have all these policies in place? And so I really think it needs to be at a very, very super local level, reassessing what do community members need? Where are they fishing? Another issue is we don't have fish landing counts in Bocas. So people go fishing and they might sell some lobster here, some octopus there, some snapper over here, but we don't have a major fish market anymore because of overfishing. So there's no understanding of where these fish landings are happening, how much is being extracted, where people are going, what banks are they using. And that's basic fisheries management. So it's a combination of everything. We need to find out what people need, where they're getting their protein source from, and getting that together first, I think is where I would start, but that's just me.
Awesome. Yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Scott. If our panelists would like, we do have other questions that were sent to me. Would you want me to pose another one, or do you want one more? Okay, so it looks like we've got some, it's more about MPAs. Would active ecological restoration of mangroves / reefs / habitats be more effective than an MPA?
No, I don't know. Okay, so that's also really complicated because the purpose of restoration is to restore, coral reefs that have been either inadvertently dredged or, in areas where they have been destroyed. And that doesn't always necessarily overlap with the interests of where an MPA should go, because that also depends on fisheries stocks and it depends on what the goal of the MPA is, and every MPA has a different goal. So like in the goals for the marine protected area in Bocas, for example, it's to preserve samples of the different habitats of Bocas and to promote tourism and to provide spaces for sea turtles to nest. Those are the goals. And then in 2016, they added they included something about people finally in 2016 after like 30 years. So, this question, there's some overlap, but they're very different goals. So you got to define the goals.
I agree. Most of the MPA's goals are biodiversity and protect important habitat. So mangrove is an important habitat for the biodiversity. So we can just go directly to the mangrove, but restoration is really hard things to do. Often there are mistakes to plant mangrove in some places, and where sediment and water doesn't really work, but they do it because it's kind of like a provider social license, or some of the companies who's actually doing something over there, and really addressing the actual issue why mangrove were gone in the first place, such as developing a new aquaculture, or providing people who actually lost the means to have the firewood. So that wasn't really, so it really, I wouldn't say it depends, but MPA is not, it's just a word, really. It's kind of like a very loosely defined. Now it becomes like a 30%. There are like 3 different MPA definitions. One's by the FAO, and then one's by the IUCN, and the other one is for the CBD. And then they're all slightly different. Some includes the fishermen into it, some includes some activities into it, some completely doesn't include anyone, not even coming into it. So you really have to look at what's the definition of an MPA and what's the agenda behind it. And then from there, you can really see in some places, they call for the MPA, but they actually have a very different agendas. And then sometimes they actually claim MPA is good for the climate change. Mangrove restoration is good for the climate change. To some extent, it is the truth, but in terms of scale, sometimes it's quite deceptive. So I'll be very careful with that.
So do you want us to answer this question about the turtles and the straws?
If anyone wanted to, it was just another question I had that someone had sent me. Yeah. But if anyone wants to keep talking about the MPAs, if you would like another question, I have a few backlogged. If anyone wants to answer another one.
Well, I think the straws and the turtles, I think, charismatic marine megafauna are always, whales, dolphins, turtles, people love them. And it's the same thing with the reef friendly, reef safe sunscreens. Like, that's not the main issue, right? The main issue is we have a problem with climate change and plastics and all kinds of things. And I think it's a way for people to be able to latch on to something that makes them feel good, that they're able to contribute. But then these might also be people who are shopping fast fashion and not realizing the actual impact they're having. So yeah, that's a complicated one as well. I think people like what they like, and it's hard to get them to move. I think Anna, probably you might be better versed at this one.
No, I agree with you. I do see shifts finally happening, and I think it's a couple of factors coming together. At least in the plastics movement, I see a shift happening as people really broaden the lens to look at the full supply chain and to look at where's the greatest harm. So straws in turtles' noses are really alarming and graphic and get people all riled up. And so maybe that's a starting point, but I think really broadening to look at where's the greatest harm. And the greatest harm, although plastic is a huge issue in the ocean, but as I talked about before, the greatest harm is in communities and is in climate change and is those intersections between fossil fuel and public health. It might be, I'm just thinking out loud, but like a little less sexy, like people love animals, and maybe we just need to look at this as like, it's a starting point, and then once you get people engaged, then you can really go for the jugular. That's a horrible expression. But while I'm talking, I actually wanted to ask a quick question, and then we're so over time, but it's great to be able to talk to the panelists. I wanted to ask Dr. Boyd a question just about climate policy, and are you seeing anything emerging looking more at the drawdown side from a policy standpoint, at least maybe in US climate policy, anything that's looking at sequestration or regenerative or drawdown as we look at emissions?
You mean carbon removal in the sense that like working on, restoration of forests and other lands to remove more carbon? Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think that the Biden commitment will likely include totally unrealistic assessment of how much carbon can be removed by better forest management in the United States, because the United States has typically relied on the fact that we have, a pretty substantial forest sink. Although I think if you look at what happened here in California last year, right, with 4 million acres burned, roughly 93 million tons of emissions, which was about a fourth of the entire 2020 target for the state of California, the entire target for all greenhouse gases from the entire California economy, double the amount of emissions from the electric power sector, and roughly 2/3 of the emissions, annual emissions from the transportation sector. So my view is that land and forests have been treated as sort of a possible, niche solution. We can do more by planting more trees and regenerating or doing regenerative agriculture, climate smart agriculture, et cetera. I think that's a total false hope in many respects because of the vulnerability of our forests, in part because of forest management. The Trump administration was actually correct about that, but in part because of climate change. And so we need to really be thinking about how we move land and forests, and I'm convinced oceans as well, to the center of the climate emergency, and think of the climate challenge as not just an energy challenge, but as one that really involves the oceans, land, forests, and the way we live, obviously. So I guess I'm quite skeptical of the heavy reliance on natural climate solutions is the phrase that is often used. Again, this is typical big NGO talk. I think there are things we can do to better manage our forests. And I think California has realized over the last couple of years that they now have a big problem with the amount of emissions that are coming from forest fires, and will continue to have this problem if they don't get that under control. Much of that is happening on federal land, of course, which then creates all kinds of challenges with respect to the federal government kind of stepping in. I do think for the first time, California is going to start incorporating land and forests into the climate change scoping plan and thinking about how to deal with the forest problem and the fact that it is now a source of emissions in terms of the overall inventory. But there are no easy solutions there. I mean, to me, I'm far more optimistic about the reductions that we can expect to see in the power sector and in energy more generally. So you can see a pathway with renewables costs declining dramatically and the increasing amount of renewable energy in our power system, and the fact that electric vehicles now are starting to kick in and become affordable, and all of that is scaling. It's all synergistic. I can see a pathway. We're not moving fast enough, but I can see a pathway where we get to, close to net zero emissions in the power sector and perhaps in some of these other sectors by mid-century. Again, a lot of things have to happen for that to occur, but I do think you can at least see the pathway. With land and forest, I don't see the pathway. It's kind of a zero-sum game. I think the oceans is probably similar in some ways, right? It's sort of, there's just too many competing issues here. There's too much sort of complexity on these, especially when you look at tropical forests, right? And these complex, unruly tropical frontiers, it is really messy. And there's no obvious technological solution there. So it's possible, with regenerative agriculture and some reforestation and restoration, we can make a little bit of a difference on the margins, though. I think our bigger problem, though, is trying to actually deal with the fact that we're moving from sink to source, in a lot of the temperate and boreal regions. I mean, Siberia, the amount of forests that burned in Siberia last year, I think, was roughly the size of the state of Colorado, which is that's just 1 year, right? And then Australia, I mean, it was just incredible. So the Amazon, the fires this past year were worse than they were in 2019. 2019, of course, is when everybody was all up in arms about the fires, but they were actually worse this year, and deforestation is up substantially this year. So you know, maybe there's a silver bullet technology out there that Bill Gates will, you know, pay for, that'll somehow figure out how to pull carbon out of the air. But you know, a lot of times people default back to trees, and Trump and these guys were talking about 1 trillion trees, right? They're going to go plant 1 trillion trees. Well, they assume that there's all this marginal land out there that nobody lives on, right? Where are you going to plant all these trillion trees? And this is, again, this is probably the similar problem to the marine protected areas. There are actually people that live in and depend upon these lands, and planting, massive tree planting efforts can become a highly effective form of enclosure and dispossession, essentially. And we've seen that all throughout history. So I guess I'm much less optimistic that forests and land use are going to be part of the solution. I'm much more concerned that we're not making it, kind of putting it at the center of the problem. Because when you've got 4 million acres a year, 4% of the state of California burning, you know, if we have another few years like that, for those of us who are here, right? I mean, it is the air quality issues, it's awful, right? And it affects everyone, but it affects obviously frontline communities far more than wealthier communities. So
I'm gonna go have to eat like a pint of vegan ice cream or something. Drown my sorrows. I do have to go, but thank you all so much.
Gotta go.
Yeah,
Inspiring and depressing.
thank you
it
all.
was so nice to meet everyone and the panelists. It's a pleasure.
I'm totally inspired by your work, though, all of your work. So thank you for what you do.
Thank
Likewise.
Thank you. Thank you for all the information.
Thanks, students, for the organizing.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Yeah.